and the Canadian government for your respective roles in making this conference and our participation possible. We have come to Vancouver to this historic dialogue of nations with a view to joining the rest of the international community in the search for practical and lasting solutions to the enormous and complex problems that face us and the rest of mankind in the provision of adequate, decent, and healthy environments in the places where human beings live and work, so that the fast dwindling art of harmonious and dignified living can be restored to ever-increasing numbers of the human race. Whether we like it or not, we live in a world which has been divided up into distinct political units. Whether we like it or not, we live in different geographical regions and under different environmental conditions. But we all belong to a single species and share a single planet, which is our home. Rich or poor, small or large, developed or developing, our fortunes are inextricably interlinked. The geographical isolation which once segmented our world and made it possible for people to live in their own particular corners, completely ignorant of the problems of others and indifferent to their struggles and suffering, has been shattered by modern developments in transport and communications. Yet, alas, we still remain greatly divided. What is needed in order to make the idea of a single united world a reality is a new and enlarged humanism that makes each one of us his brother's keeper. This has been the dream of countless generations. It is the underlying idea of the United Nations, and we must endeavor to give it concrete expression in our own lifetime and within the few remaining years of this century. This conference, we believe, offers us a unique opportunity for the realization of this dream. The primary responsibility for solving the human settlement problems of every nation must rest with its own government and citizens. But it would be futile for each nation to confine its efforts and attention solely to its boundaries. For our collective historical experiences, technological achievements, and cultural backgrounds constitute a vast reservoir of potential wealth and strength which can be tapped for the mutual benefit of all of us. Every nation is in a position to make a contribution and to profit from the experiences of others, and the process should be greatly facilitated by the audiovisual component which has been incorporated into the structure of this conference. Ghana's experience in the planning and development of human settlements has been diverse and challenging, especially since the attainment of independence. We have had to meet rising demands and expectations not only in quantity, but also in quality. However, for our audiovisual presentation for this conference, we have selected only 2 of the projects undertaken by us in recent years because they serve to illustrate in a very clear manner 2 important but contrasting aspects of the country's human settlement problems as they relate to the process of economic development at both rural and urban levels. Before the Volta project came into being in the mid-60s, Ghana had no developed source of indigenous power, and we relied on imported fuels for practically all our energy requirements. Although our economy depended on the export of bulky agricultural and mineral products, we had only one modern harbor supported by a few roadstead ports based on the use of surf boats. The decision to dam the Volta River for the generation of electricity pointed to the need for a second modern harbor located close by in order to facilitate construction of the dam and power plant and subsequently to promote the development of industries requiring modern port facilities as well as readily available supplies of fairly cheap electricity. This was the rationale behind the construction of the port and industrial town of Tema. The construction of the Volta Dam and the creation of a vast lake behind it led to the dislocation of 80,000 people from their homes and the destruction of 600 towns and villages. The task of resettling these people was a formidable one, but it gave our planners, social workers, and administrators the opportunity of designing 52 new settlements capable of providing viable homes and working environments for their new occupants, while the construction of Tema provided a unique opportunity for trying out the latest ideas in urban planning and urban management. In many respects, the planning of the resettlement villages and the movement of people into them proved to be a far more difficult task than the creation of the brand new town of Tema, where the most serious problem was how to persuade the inhabitants of the original fishing village to move to a new and modern village specially built for them. But in the search for solutions to the difficult human problems involved in moving people from their ancestral homes into new environments, two important ideas emerged that were largely responsible for the successful outcome of the experiment. These were, firstly, the idea of providing families not with fully completed houses, but rather with core houses containing only the basic essentials and capable of further expansion by the occupants themselves according to their means, needs, and wishes. And secondly, the principle of self-help which was employed in the new villages, thus enabling their occupants to participate in the construction and development of their new homes, and on an individual and personal basis in the agricultural and other economic activities associated with them. The Volta project brought vividly home to our planners and administrators the need for an integrated approach in all attempts at economic transformation, especially those that involve significant modifications of the natural environment. If we were to do it all over again, we would not wish to depart in any way from the principle of self-help embodied in the original project, but we would give much more emphasis to the ecological and environmental aspects, especially in respect of those critical interfaces where there is active interaction between human beings and water. Today, the initial excitement generated by the Volta project and the construction of Tema has given way to new concerns. We are now faced with a less dramatic but infinitely more difficult problem of providing adequate shelter and viable settlements for a population that is growing at the rate of 2.7% per annum. And these needs have to be met in the face of rising costs and rising expectations, and within a social context where there is now a greatly increased awareness of the need for social justice. Unfortunately, some of the most serious constraints on our ability to build more houses and to keep building costs within reasonable limits lie outside our control. They derive from the high costs of imported building materials, which are often absolutely indispensable. Thus, in a sense, Mr. President, our ability to satisfy some of our basic needs in human settlements depends on the willingness of the industrialized countries to offer us more reasonable trading terms. On our side, we are taking positive steps to keep the population growth in check through imaginative programs of family planning education based on voluntary participation and a recognition of the fact that by reducing our population growth, we can more effectively raise our standard of living. We do not expect this conference to provide ready solutions to our problems or those of any other country, but we do expect it to offer us the opportunity of having a fruitful dialogue with other countries so that we can derive useful ideas and examples to guide our efforts. We hope that it will also lead to the strengthening and rationalization of institutions for dealing with the problems of human settlements, which will devote the greater part of their energies to the actual solution of problems and not to endless and fruitless studies aimed at defining their nature. There is enough accumulated technical knowledge to enable us to act. What we need most of all is the will to make a start. But let me emphasize once again that the primary responsibility for solving these problems must rest with each individual nation. This is how we view this matter in Ghana, and the approach we have adopted in tackling our housing and human settlement problems has been based on self-reliance and the mobilization and use of our own material and human resources to the fullest possible extent. We do not reject outside help, but we consider that it can only play a secondary and supplementary role. There can be no doubt that the root cause of most of the problems which face the world in the sphere of human settlements is poverty and the maldistribution of wealth within and among nations. While it is well within the means of governments to promote the welfare and protect the economic interests of all their citizens, no comparable machinery exists for safeguarding the economic interests of states and for protecting them against exploitation by other states. Only our consciences can provide that machinery, but they cannot do this effectively unless they are guided by a code of international conduct which all nations are prepared to accept, support, and observe. In our view, Mr. President, that code is the new international economic order. Without it, the good intentions we expressed at this conference cannot go very far, and we hope that as a result of the discussions that will take place here in the course of the next few days, we may be enabled to see the importance of this new order in a new and fuller light. A more equitable trading pattern between the industrialized nations and the Third World will not only increase the earning power of the latter, but will also make them less dependent on foreign aid. Over and above the exchange of ideas, the transfer of technology, and the mounting of special programs of aid, the best contribution that any nation, especially the developed nations, can make towards the solution of the world's human settlement problems is to assist in bringing about as speedily as possible a new world order based on greater economic justice for all nations and all peoples. Thank you. Capsule, please.
Well,
the waters of Ghana's River Volta were tamed to form the Volta Lake behind the dam at Akosombo, 105 kilometers northeast of Accra, the capital. The lake thus formed destroyed the houses of 80,000 people from over 700 villages. Some of the displaced people were resettled in new townships located in entirely new surroundings. Each family was initially allocated a nuclear house, which can be extended through aided self-help and expanded as the family grows. The resettlers were encouraged to use modern methods to farm on cooperative basis. Other forms of economic activity include local crops. Some of the resettled people abandoned their new townships for more lucrative fishing grounds along the lake. Plentiful supply of electricity gave birth to an aluminium smelter and many other factories at the new port of Tema, not far from the dam. The Tema Development Corporation, which is responsible for housing the ever-growing population, has been doing its best by providing houses on ownership scheme or on agency basis for the various income groups. But a squatter settlement, a Shaiman, is developing very close to the modern township of Tema. The remedy is a crash program to construct low-cost houses for the middle and low-income groups.
I wish to thank the chairman, the executive chairman of the Environmental Protection Council of Ghana for his contribution. I apologize, during his intervention the lights went on prematurely. We'll try and watch that, and certainly it was not, his time was well filled. I believe the secretary of the conference would like to make a short announcement.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, our distinguished rapporteur asked me to request his friends to meet him at 6 p.m. sharp after our plenary meeting here. This was the message which I wanted to convey, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kedar. I now give the floor to the Minister of Lands, Housing and Urban Development of the United Republic of Tanzania, the Honorable D. Sewali.
Mr. President, on behalf of my delegation, I would like to associate myself with the previous speakers in congratulating you and the members of the Bureau upon your election to these high offices. We are confident that under your prudent guidance, the conference will definitely come to fruitful and worthwhile conclusions. To our hosts, the government and the people of Canada, we tender our sincere gratitude for the comprehensive arrangements they have made for this unprecedented conference in the history of mankind. The boundless love, the hospitality they are extending to us at this conference. Mr. President, my delegation will be simply echoing the opinion of other delegations if I assert that the main actors in the struggle for better human settlements are the individual nations themselves. Nevertheless, the exchange of experience and knowledge among nations is essential in this our common strategy of improving the quality of life in the habitat of mankind. Since Stockholm, we have realized that we can have economic growth and social justice and still be destroying non-renewable resources which are the property of mankind. The improvement of quality of life now stands on three pillars, namely economic growth, social justice, and environment. But, Mr. President, the environmental problem in the developing world is simply poverty. It is in the third world where one finds mass illiteracy, mass hunger, and widespread diseases. It is here where you find the most deprived strata of mankind in settlements, comprising of poor shelters, very poor sewage systems, or none at all, and in many instances, no transport and communication system. In most developing countries, the majority of the population lives in the rural areas. In Tanzania, for instance, the rural population constitutes of 95% of the country's population, which we should therefore, in Tanzania, for instance, the rural population constitutes 95% of the country's population. We should therefore ask ourselves seriously as to what is the major preoccupation of the third world at the national level. Obviously, the major action at national level in the developing countries is the elimination of these negative poverty, or rather a degree of poverty, which means misery and degrades and satisfies the human person. And our first task is to recognize and understand the boundaries and limitations which this degree of poverty imposes. Mr. President, growth mania of the developed world has distorted the global environment and has robbed the world of its non-renewable resources for no better end than output of ballistic missiles. The current exploitive international economic order has forced the developing nations to sell themselves to the international tourist industry in pursuit of those symbols of wealth and progress the developed countries have taught them to adopt: luxurious hotels, 6-lane motorways, etc., whereas their people end up as veranda boys and their proudest traditions soon degenerate. At most, the developed effort goes to the big cities, which means that above 80% of the population are largely bypassed. Mr. President, an improved quality of life must be made available to the rural population in order to reduce the massive migration to the cities. Rapid urbanization has led to poor or makeshift housing, lack of sanitation, inadequate transportation, insufficient schooling facilities, and social tensions, all of which slow down the pace of economic development. It is also an undisputable fact that a disciplined workforce required for rapid economic development does not develop in an environment where parasitic diseases are endemic, where transport is unreliable, and where workers are illiterate. Hence, investment in services and facilities to the rural population is essential for optimizing the socio-economic return on other investments. We feel it just proper to mention here that the developed countries should feel their responsibility to help the betterment of the quality of life in the developing countries. Mr. President, we all know that the rural-urban drift in the developing countries is, in the final analysis, the exchange of one misery for another. Nevertheless, the city offers several advantages in terms of amenities and services and a hope for a better day, whereas in the rural areas is mere despair and further degradation. In most developing countries, social facilities such as big hospitals, schools, and good roads are found in cities where a very small percentage of the country's population live. Our stated, we must not forget that people who live in towns can possibly become exploiters of those who live in rural areas. All our big hospitals are in towns, and they benefit only a small section of Tanzania. It is in the overseas sales of peasants' production which provides the foreign exchange. Those who do not get the benefit of the hospitals thus carry the major responsibility for paying for them. Among other things, the Arusha Declaration directed that this economic and social injustice must end. It is with this in mind that the Tanzania government is directing more of its funds to the rural areas with the aim of raising their productivity and consequently the standard of living of the peasantry. This social justice to the rural population is being implemented through the program of villagization of the rural areas throughout the country. All the ministries and parastate organizations are answering the call for rural transformation. This, in practical terms, means that people in the rural areas who are the most deprived and constitute the low-income class should now receive priority in our development programs. Thus, for example, 70% of 1972 to 1973 national budget for health services was devoted to rural health services, compared with less than 50% in the previous year. Mr. President, we all know that the building of better rural water supplies greatly improves the living conditions of the peasants. They improve the well-being of the peasants and reduce the amount of effort that has to be spent on obtaining these basic necessities. By the end of the year 1976, every peasant in our rural area is expected to be living in villages. We have, therefore, planned that the provision of adequate and hygienic water to everyone must be completed by 1980. This means that our efforts and resources are now concentrated on drilling boreholes, constructing dams, digging shallow wells, etc. throughout the country. We have also launched on our universal primary education. Our goal is that every school-age child should be able to go to school by 1977. For the last 5 years, the government and the party were intensively involved in wiping out illiteracy through adult education programs. As for shelter, Mr. President, the rural families, through self-help in the construction of their houses, basically meet their needs. However, to bring about a qualitative improvement of housing and provision of the necessary infrastructure to the villages, the government has established mobile construction units. These units are intended to give technical advice needed at the construction sites in the villages. In order to speed up development in the rural areas, the government in 1972 adopted the policy to decentralize its powers and vest them in the regions, thus enabling the public to participate fully in all decisions for socio-economic development. In the same spirit, the government headquarters is now in the process of being transferred to Dodoma town, which is geographically central to the country for the purpose of rendering maximum socio-economic development to the rural population who form the majority of our population. Mr. President, parallel with the rural development policy, my government takes care of the urban population, which forms about 5% of the country's population. The National Housing Corporation, established in 1962, is the major supplier of dwelling houses. The National Estate and Design Company Limited was also established to design houses for the public sector, whereas the Tanzania Housing Bank gives loans for housing purposes to both the urban and rural population. In order to implement these projects smoothly and effectively, several institutions of learning were established. Other institutions, for example, trains sub-professional physical land use planners, surveyors, estate managers, and building technologists. The training program at Ardhi Institute is being jointly carried out by United Nations assistance through UNDP Technical Assistance, the International Development Agency of the World Bank, special training program incorporated in the Sites and Service Program, and the Tanzania government. The Institute, if expanded, can cater for a greater region in the training of sub-professionals in the field of human settlements. Mr. President, before I proceed, may I show you a film entitled Ujamaa Villages, which manifests the problems of human settlements in Tanzania and the methods we have used in solving these problems. Capture, please.
In Tanzania, human settlements are basically rural, as 95% of the 15 million people live in the rural areas. Scattered homesteads like this have been the mode of human settlements in rural Tanzania for thousands of years. Many families have been subjected to lack of schools for their children, lack of roads, lack of medical facilities, poor water supply, and inadequate agricultural facilities, resulting into poor yields. In order to make the optimum use of the country's meager resources to benefit the majority of the masses, it became necessary to devise ways and means to abandon the old method of living in scattered homesteads and instead live together in villages and work together for the good of all. One of the necessities in human settlement is water. Piped water supplies are designed such that the farthest standpipe is at most a quarter of a mile from the consumer in villages. By living together, it is easier to eradicate illiteracy. Building permanent and decent dwelling houses is another operation when people have settled. Local building materials, such as burnt bricks, are extensively used. In agricultural undertakings, for example, which are all done collectively, some of these villages have reached the stage of mechanization to increase their productivity. Rural isolation perpetuates poverty, disease, and ignorance. By recollectivizing the peasantry into organized and planned villages, we are going to unleash the otherwise wasted human energy for the improvement of the quality of life of all Tanzanians.
Mr. President, I have not been utilizing this opportunity as a platform for introducing the Tanzania National Report. Rather, I have tried to discern from a multitude of human settlement problems those that I think are of common interest to us all and on which we need to formulate a common stand. We have thus come to this beautiful city of Vancouver to learn from each other possible solutions to the problems of human settlements, which we hope will lead to the formulation of policies by governments. We should therefore guard against taking a position which is too abstract. My country still believes that the proliferation of UN bodies is undesirable. Instead, an innovative and imaginative rearrangement of existing ones should be undertaken with the context of restructuring of the economic sectors of the UN organization. It is against this background that the international organization, which shall be formed hereafter, should structure-wise and function-wise be geared towards assisting member states in solving their human settlement problems, which are essentially more of a socio-economic nature and less of an environmental aspect. My delegation will, in the appropriate committee, elaborate further on this subject. Before I end, I wish also to take this opportunity to appeal to the international community to address itself to the special problems of those countries whose human settlements have suffered greatly as a result of wars of national liberation and the natural disasters. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the Minister for Lands, Housing and Urban Development of the United Republic of Tanzania, and also thank her for her kind words towards the Secretary General and myself and the host country, so that others may have an opportunity to complete their interventions in the time allocated. Perhaps we can once more, without presuming, assume that those good wishes follow without being restated. The next speaker is the chairman of the National Environment Commission of Portugal, His Excellency Mr. José Correa de Cunha, to whom I now give the floor.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, honorable delegates, the United Nations Annual Settlements is at last underway in this beautiful city of Vancouver. Due to its worldwide projection, the nature of the concerns that led to its convocation, and the importance of the decisions that it is expected will be taken, the Portuguese government considers that this conference is one of the United Nations initiatives with the greatest significance for the creation of a new social order and a more human framework of life all over the world. In this field, the message of Stockholm has not been forgotten. Far from it. It will be prolonged for our benefit and that of future generations by a declaration of principles that we hope will constitute one of the fundamental results of this conference, which is perfectly up to the seriousness of the problems facing mankind. But, ladies and gentlemen, the Portuguese government does not want to fail to express the solemn wish that this assembly will go far beyond the mere manifestation of intentions to correspond to the hopes and excitement that have been generated around this conference. We must work under the sign of efficiency and the search for courageous and valid solutions. In fact, what is at stake are not just problems arising from the housing shortage or the flagrant shortage of many existing units. It is not just a question, therefore, of thinking up ways of building more and better. What, above all, seems to be at stake is the possibility of being able to associate the right to housing with a sufficiently broad concept of a healthy environment that is ecologically balanced and correctly managed. This objective requires a tri-dimensional policy, including social aspects, the pre-planning of space, and forecasting. The first mentioned will imply, in any case, the adoption of new standards of justice in relations between the various peoples and social strata, walks of life, so that all citizens may benefit from decent housing, and it is possible to prevent measures of economic or political segregation that give rise to ghettos almost all over the world. The pre-planning of space, in turn, takes on ever greater importance in view of the land shortage of land which is suitable for setting up new urban centers or enlarging already existing ones. A minimum balance must be guaranteed in the new urbanized landscapes by designing them, conceiving them on a human scale, without this resulting in an adulteration or substantial reduction of the areas devoted to any type of rural occupation. Finally, it will be necessary to take into account the baneful consequences to which the whole of mankind may be subjected in the next few decades if there is not a deliberate option to contain, to check the present rate of population growth. It is the improvement of the quality of life of the most backward peoples that is especially at stake, and there is a serious risk that all the measures to be adopted will fail if a consensus is not achieved in this field. In any case, in the absence of some sort of cataclysm, the dynamics of the present population trend will lead to a trifold increase in very few generations. It is therefore with our eyes glued on the future needs that we must begin to plan today, united by the same ardent desire for universal justice and concord. Faced with this challenge, Portugal could not be indifferent. Nobody is unaware of how much it costs to guarantee the right to housing, and how many shortages there are in this field in many corners of the globe. Portugal feels this problem for herself, for the peoples to whom she is most closely connected, and, naturally, as a full member of the world community, to which she is bound by an ever more spontaneous and conscious solidarity. The problems that most countries in the world are facing today in the field of human settlements will require much more than a simple multiplication of efforts. They will require a total reformulation of objectives and the conception of new types of society. In Portugal, the revolution that took place in 1974 may facilitate this process of renovation through the rational use of the gigantic programs that will have to be carried out over the next 20 years. The sharp development imbalances that affect Portugal, the many contradictions of a political, economic, and social character to which she is subject, and the hard work that must be done, lead us to attach overriding great importance to the break with the past that is being experienced in my country today. From the political viewpoint, our Constitution, recently drawn up on the basis of perfect democratic authenticity, contains the universal principles of the right of all citizens to health, work, housing, in short, to an environment that is worthy of a society that wants to be just, responsible, and progressive. From the administrative viewpoint, a proposal aimed at setting up a new regional division of the country is now under discussion. This proposal opens up a broad prospects for the participation of the population in the definition of the most suitable development plans. Traumatized, scarred, marked by the effects of a long war, and with its traditional structures affected by massive migratory movements, the most recent of which brought to its shores in a few months about 1 million citizens from the former African territories, the Portuguese population is now open-minded and willing to accept great decisions. In the field of housing, they are being taken in line with the inventory of shortages that has already been carried out. The present urban network, excessively polarized in Lisbon and Oporto, is not cohesive because it lacks medium, average-sized towns conveniently distributed throughout the interior and south of the country. The balance sheet of the present situation leads us to estimate that the housing shortage is about 600,000 units, which corresponds to 25% of the existing stock. The percentage of the population that is resident in urban areas is still very low, 28%, which leads to the forecast that the next few years will see the shift of about 1 million families who must be guaranteed decent housing in their new places of residence and work. By about the end of the century, there are prospects for the building of over 1.5 million housing units, which may require a basic reappraisal review of pre-planning schemes, physical planning, and will originate an overall investment of nearly $30,000 million. This figure gives us an idea of the scope, the greatness of the task of national reconstruction that the Portuguese people are facing today. That is why we are here, ready to exchange our experience and to support the creation of structures capable of replying at the international level to the scope and nature of the needs which in this field are facing most of the people. In various bodies and on several occasions, my country has already stated that it is opposed to the establishment of a new United Nations organ for coordinating and galvanizing policies directly concerned with habitat. On the other hand, it has shown interest in promoting and pursuing a better use of the available means of intervention, many of which are scattered among various jurisdictions and fora. I am referring concretely and with the due emphasis to the United Nations Programme for the Environment, UNEP, and the Foundation for Human Settlements, which was set up within this program and has already proved that it is capable of becoming a tool of great interest. We are only waiting for a desirable clarification of the situation and for a substantial number of countries to join it. Should that happen, Portugal is all ready to join in. On the other hand, directly dependent on ECOSOC, there is a specialized center, the Housing, Building and Planning Center, which also appears to be worthy of the closest attention due to its results during several years of work in this field. In the opinion of the Portuguese delegation, a correct coordination of the activities of all these bodies and perhaps of other less influential ones is one of the paramount objectives of this conference. It will depend upon us whether it is attained through a clear appreciation of the interests involved and the maintenance of a firm will to overcome temporary difficulties so that we can concentrate on the real aspects, the essential aspects of the problem. And these, of course, are connected with the dramatic situation in which thousands of millions of human beings live, even today, prevented by the deficiency of the societies into which they are inserted from attaining the minimum standards of living to which they have a right. This situation, when projected to the end of the century, takes on frightening, terrifying characteristics and in itself imposes a further concentration for collective action deliberately supported by the technically advanced countries. It is with this aim that we have gathered here, determined to practice a solidarity that cannot go on being an empty word. There is but one earth, and the peoples of this earth will also have to get together to reply to the challenge that this conference represents and help to build the better world that we all want. Before concluding, Mr. President, I should like to thank, on behalf of my government, express my thanks for the tremendous efforts made by the Canadian government, the fine people of Vancouver, and the Secretary General, Mr. Penaloza, and his fellow workers for the fine success of this conference. Thank you, Mr. President.
Council, please.
Le Portugal occupe à l'extrême du continent.
Now, Portugal is the western part of the European continent, and geography and history has profoundly marked our land. And this means we have a highly diversified land. There are great imbalances in development which characterize our country, and we try to check them by taking advantage of the major changes which Portuguese society is now bringing about. Now, to bring about these changes, the solutions which are being advocated are of paramount importance in the field of human settlements. These many political, economic, and social contradictions, as well as the very close relationship with regional development, physical planning, the protection and improvement of environment, fully warrant and justify the importance which is being assigned to the working out of a human settlement policy. The challenge of such a task has mobilized already many material and human elements which are necessary to solve this problem and for the rapid elaboration of projects to solve this. The very speedy evolution of our economy over the past quarter of a century and the impact throughout the entire territory, the very great increase in migration which occurred over the past 10 years are the very basis of the problems which Portuguese society must face. Among these social and cultural structures, there are many which are archaic. Our urban network is helter-skelter. We have 9 million inhabitants, but they are poorly distributed. In the field of housing, the present needs may be reckoned at about 600,000 dwellings, the building of which, in addition to the needs for the next decades, represents a very heavy burden. Thus, that explains the importance given to physical planning, and thus the greatness of the challenge which the entire Portuguese people and government together are involved and which we are determined to win. Thank you.
I thank the chairman of the National Environment Commission of Mexico. Before I call upon the next speaker, I should mention that the next delegation has ceded part of their time to the USSR on a cooperative basis with the Ukrainian delegation. I now give the floor to the chairman of the Committee on Construction of the Council of Ministers of the Byelorussian Soviet Socialist Republic, His Excellency Mr. Vladimir Koral.
Mr. President, I'd like to show a film about Minsk, number 174. This was Minsk in 1944. Today, Minsk is one of the major administrative, industrial, scientific and cultural centers of the country. The capital of the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic. Reconstruction of the center of the capital went through the axis of the town, which is the Lenin Prospect. Account was taken of the need for green spaces and amenities in the territory. There are two highways running through parks. Minsk was built very quickly, in a very short time. It was a multi-million population. Originally, buildings were in terms of quarters, but now we have micro-regions. We have more than 100 of these. Most important things to do is to give every family its own flat. The housing stock in Minsk by 1975 amounted to more than 40 million square meters. Services for the population are carried out on a step system. Primary services concerned with everyday requirements, education, and this is all taken care of in micro-regions. There are culture and sporting complexes concentrated in the center of living regions. Theaters, museums, specialized shops are normally found in the center of planning regions. Water for Minsk is one of the most important elements in town planning. There are reservoirs and other water storage capacity plants around the city, and there are green belts. Building is continuing. Models are made by architects of new regions of the town, which show the image of Minsk as it will look in the year 2000. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, the government of the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic was very pleased indeed to adopt the resolution of the General Assembly of the United Nations to hold the Human Settlements Conference. The Belarusian SSR views the conference, the Habitat Conference, as a continuation of the tremendous work done by the United Nations over the last 10 years in the field of housing, building and planning, and wishes to express its wholehearted conviction that the documents produced by the conference will make a considerable contribution to the further comprehensive development and intensification of cooperation among states with different social systems. The Byelorussian delegation would like to mention the great work done by the preparatory committee in preparing for the conference. It's well known what damage was done by the Second World War to the Byelorussian SSR. We had 209 towns, 9,200 villages burned and destroyed. The housing stock of the towns in our country were ruined in terms of 75% of the available housing. The intensive restoration of the economy and living conditions of the Republic began immediately after the liberation of Byelorussia. In a very short period of time, the Byelorussian people, with the fraternal assistance of all the peoples of the Soviet Union, were able not only to restore all its towns and villages, but in large measure made them better and more beautiful than they had been before the war. In our country, in post-war years, new towns have been built, which, in terms of their planning and construction, in terms of their level of comfort and convenience, are beginning to overtake towns which date back hundreds of years. In Byelorussia, as indeed throughout the whole Soviet Union, we have a unified strategy in the field of the development and improvement of the network of population centers based upon socialist principles of the organization of the national economy in the light of national traditions. The specific features of our republic account for the following particular features in our general strategy. The predominance in our republic of processing industry makes for relatively free choice in the location of production, but we subordinate this deployment to the social tasks of planned urbanization. The development of rural and urban population centers is viewed not in isolation, but as a unified system of population distribution consisting of groups of interdependent populated centers. The relatively even development of the territory of our republic has promoted the exercising of control over the use of land and has led to a deliberate attempt to control the environment on the basis of a complex of social, economic, and ecological factors. The contemporary requirements of the organization of socialist production have created conditions for the planned reduction of the number of very small villages on the one hand, and for the limitation of the growth of very big cities on the other hand. Both have promoted an enhancement of the amenities of the living conditions. A great deal of importance attaches for the further development of town planning in our republic to the government-approved scientific program for the dispersal and development of towns and villages in Byelorussia up to the year 2000. The program has reflected the close interdependence of economic and territorial planning. A fundamental instrument in the realization of this program is the preparation and implementation in actual practice of projects for regional planning which cover the whole territory of the Republic. The construction of the towns in Byelorussia is based on general plans which constitute fundamental documents which determine the unified functional, architectural, and plan structure of the towns and determine the solutions to problems of the effective regulation of the growth of big cities. In order to ensure that the urban environment takes account of aesthetic considerations, we are trying to create spaces which have architectural appeal, emotional appeal, and aesthetic appeal. The urban environment must consist of harmoniously combined natural and artificial elements. One of the high priority tasks in this context, which we are facing and trying to solve today, is the reconstruction of urban centers, and primarily the city of Minsk, taking into account their town planning, architectural, historical, and artistic value. I'd like to say something now about some general questions connected with town planning policy in our republic. The structure of the medium-sized towns in Byelorussia is determined in the light of the function of the town in the region. Some of them have been developed as regional and industrial centers, others as administrative, economic, and educational centers of agricultural regions, and some as scientific centers and centers for leisure, rest homes, and tourism. The development of small towns and large villages is very closely connected with the implementation of the state policy of the radical reorganization of rural population centers. The narrowing down of differences between the way of life of city and country dwellers is reflected in the multi-variety of activities in work, daily life, leisure, and has led to social homogeneity and puts one in mind of the unity of the environment in which these processes are occurring. All this, the final purpose of all this is the implementation of the social economic task, the gradual limitation of differences between town and country, between the standards of living of town and country dwellers, and the implementation of the requirements of the 25th Communist Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Housing construction in the towns of our republic is carried out at the expense of the government and also at the expense of the population. That is so-called cooperative construction. The structure of state and cooperative houses provide for a similar level of modern conveniences regardless of the social composition of the inhabitants. The creation of a powerful base for the building industry in our republic has made it possible to place housing construction on an industrial footing. At the present time, more than 60% of houses are built from factory-produced components. In considering such a vitally important question as housing construction, we must take into account another factor, namely the amount of rent. Nowhere is it lower than in our country. Apartment rents in our country have not changed since 1928, in spite of the fact that in the course of that period, the infrastructure for dwellings has improved tremendously. Payment for lodging, rent, and services covers only 1/3 of the actual expense. Therefore, every year, the state budget sets aside about 5 billion rubles for housing and services. Our country will continue to make such expenditures. This was stated in his speech at the meeting of the workers of the automobile factory in Moscow by the General Secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Comrade Brezhnev. Housing construction and urban planning in our republic is carried on in close collaboration with the development of the system of citywide and long-distance transport in order to reduce any damage to the environment. The Soviet town planning techniques give pride of place to mass passenger transport. In the major towns of Byelorussia, more than 90% of the people travel by public transport. Thanks to the work done in order to harmonize the development of transport and planned structures, main highways in our towns bear an even traffic load. The preservation and transformation of the urban environment is part of the deliberate policy of the government of Byelorussian SSR based on laws with regard to health and the preservation of the environment. Thank you.
I thank the chairman of the Committee on Construction of the Council of Ministers of the Byelorussian Soviet Socialist Republic, and realize that his time was shortened because part of it was ceded to the distinguished delegate from the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The next speaker is the Minister of Housing and Village Development of Malaysia, His Excellency Mr. Michael Chen, to whom I now